Imagine a sound that silences an entire crowd of Hollywood millionaires and top-tier producers. It is not a deafening gunshot or a scream of rage, but a quiet, almost ghostly rustle of silk and the barely perceptible clink of ice in a glass that has suddenly frozen in space, as if the laws of gravity decided to take a day off. The calendar reads July 12th, 1988. The setting is a luxurious mansion in Beverly Hills, where the air is so thick with the scent of expensive cigars and beyond-limit arrogance that you could literally cut it with a knife. In the center of the vast living room, surrounded by a retinue of sycophants, stands Steven Seagal, the rising action star, the man who just made the whole world talk about him after the release of the film Above the Law. He is dressed in a traditional Japanese hakama, his hair perfectly slicked back, and his voice carries that cloying confidence of a man who believes he is the only true warrior in a room full of actors. Seagal is loudly, and without mincing words, proclaiming that boxing is nothing more than a primitive sporting brawl for those who do not understand the true nature of energy, and that any boxer is absolutely helpless against the holds of an Aikido master. You probably think this is just typical social chatter, an attempt to grab attention by criticizing the classics. But at this moment, reality takes a sharp turn, because sitting in a deep leather chair in the corner of the room is a man whose shadow covers the entire history of modern sports. This is Muhammad Ali, the greatest. But this is no longer the Ali who floated like a butterfly. This is a man whose body is slowly becoming a prison due to Parkinson's disease, and it is this contrast between the physical frailty of the legend and the bloated pathos of the movie star that turns the party into a psychological thriller. But before we move to the moment when Ali decides to answer this challenge, I want you to fix in your mind one tiny, almost unnoticeable detail that will become our dagger in this story. In his right hand, Ali gripped a simple glass of water, filled to the very brim. Look at it, or rather feel its weight. Because of the disease, Ali's hand trembled minutely and rhythmically, causing the water inside the glass to move in circles, creating a barely audible splash. Remember that sound, because exactly 60 seconds from now, this glass will become the primary and most merciless judge in the clash between a Hollywood myth and an authentic greatness that cannot be knocked out. Seagal, intoxicated by his own rhetoric and the attention of the crowd, made a fatal mistake. He decided that Ali's silence was a sign of weakness. He approached the champion's chair, looming over him with all his mass, and uttered the phrase that was meant to be his triumph. Muhammad, you were great at what you did, but admit it, if I simply took you by the wrist, your gloves would become your shackles. A boxer is just a slow target for someone who commands chi energy. That very visual silence hung in the room, when it seems even the air conditioners stopped humming. Ask yourself honestly, what would you have done in Ali's place? Your body no longer obeys you as it once did. Your voice has become a quiet rustle, and before you stands a young, vigorous giant who publicly calls your life's work a ballet. Would you remain silent to preserve your dignity, or try to laugh it off? Ali did neither. Here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, breaking all your expectations. Ali slowly, overcoming the resistance of his own muscles, began to rise from the chair. He didn't argue. He didn't remind anyone of Liston or Foreman. He simply stood right up to Seagal, so close that Seagal could feel the heat of his breath. His right hand still gripped that same glass of water, and he extended his left hand calmly, almost peacefully, to the actor. "Grab me, Steven," Ali whispered, and there was so much power in that whisper that Seagal hesitated for a second. "Use your very best hold. If I can't get away in 2 seconds, I will admit to everyone that boxing is just a dance." Seagal smirked, 100% confident in his technique, and his fingers closed on Ali's wrist in a death grip, from which, as he assured his students, there was no escape. But he didn't know that at this second he was holding not the hand of an old man, but a live wire under 10,000 volts, and that in a moment his idea of his own invincibility would crumble to dust, while the glass of water in Ali's hand would show everyone present a truth that cannot be hidden behind special effects. But are you ready to learn why the Aikido master's hand released on its own, and what physical anomaly made Seagal turn pale in front of the entire film crew? The answer is hidden in a movement that Bruce Lee once called the punch without a punch, and Ali was about to demonstrate it right now. To understand the full depth of the psychological hell into which Muhammad Ali voluntarily lured Steven Seagal on that sweltering July night, you need to forget about titles for a second and imagine the physical sensation of that contact, because it was within it that the first, most painful question of this duel was hidden. Seagal's fingers, trained by decades of Aikido practice, closed on Ali's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. He used a grip known in his world as Nikio, a technique designed to make an opponent beg for mercy through blinding pain in the joints. You probably think that at this moment Ali should have flinched, or at least changed his expression, for his body, eaten away by Parkinson's, should have been as fragile and yielding as a dry branch by all medical laws. But here, the conveyor belt principle kicks in, making your heart beat twice as fast. Muhammad Ali didn't just not cry out, he stopped trembling. At the very second Seagal put all his mass into the grip, the champion's hand, which had been vibrating minutely, suddenly turned into a monolith of cold granite. And this sudden transition from frailty to absolute stasis caused Seagal his first prick of irrational, almost superstitious fear. Seagal felt this resistance, but his ego, bloated by Hollywood paychecks and a crowd of flatterers, refused to believe in reality. He decided the old man was simply straining with his last bit of strength, and that the next jerk would finally break his will. "I have you, champion," the actor whispered, and his voice carried that metallic note he loved to use in his movies when his character was already celebrating victory over a villain. "One move from me, and you'll be on the floor. Your fists are useless here, because I control your center of gravity." But Ali remained silent, and that silence was denser than prison walls. He looked at Seagal with that universal sadness with which one looks at a child trying to frighten the ocean with a toy gun. And in this ringing silence, as the party guests, producers, and movie stars held their breath, expecting to see the legend's disgrace, a sound rang out that turned everything upside down. It was the quiet, rhythmic clink of ice in the glass of water that Ali still held in his right hand. Look, or rather listen, to this glass, our plot dagger, which was right now dictating the rules of the game. The water inside it stopped circling. It froze, turning into a perfect mirror reflecting the dazzling chandeliers of Beverly Hills. Ask yourself honestly, how can a man whose diagnosis officially reads uncontrollable tremor hold liquid in a glass in a state of absolute rest, while his other hand is being tried to be turned inside out? This was the moment of truth, an intellectual orgasm of biomechanics. Ali wasn't fighting Seagal with muscles, he was fighting him with his mind. He redirected all the energy of his disease, all that chaotic vibration, into a single point of the grip, turning his left arm into living water that has no form and cannot be broken. Seagal began to get truly nervous. He felt his fingers slipping on Ali's skin, even though the grip was ironclad. He put all his rage into the movement, all his weight of 110 kilograms, but the champion stood like a rock, rooted into the mansion's foundation. Here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making your brain stall. Seagal suddenly realized that he could not perform the throw. Every time he tried to turn Ali's wrist, the boxer's hand shifted microscopically, nullifying any leverage. It was like trying to grab fog or hold mercury. Seagal realized he had fallen into the trap of his own arrogance. He had publicly challenged a man who, in a single round against Joe Frazier, took more real damage than Seagal had in his entire film career. Breaking the fourth wall. Ask yourself honestly, What is it like to be the toughest guy in Hollywood and suddenly realize that you cannot budge a sick old man who isn't even looking at you? Seagal felt cold, sticky sweat crawl down his back under his silk hakama. He realized that if he didn't take Ali down now, if this performance dragged on for another 10 seconds, his myth of the invincible master would burn to ashes in front of the people his future depended on. He decided to take extreme measures. He decided to use a dirty trick, a sharp elbow strike under the gripped arm to cause pain, shock, and force Ali to collapse. He drew breath into his chest. His shoulders jerked for this underhanded move, and at that moment Ali did what no one expected. He closed the distance himself. He stepped right up to Seagal, so close that their chests touched, and in that intimate proximity, hidden from the eyes of the crowd, Ali whispered just a few words to the actor. Those words were quieter than the rustle of grass, but Seagal flinched as if he had been hit by a 10,000-volt shock. His fingers released on their own, the will to fight evaporated, and an expression of such deep confusion appeared in his eyes that the actor's retinue involuntarily recoiled. But what were those words? And why, at that second, did the glass of water in Ali's hand, which had remained motionless all this time, suddenly emit a sharp, warning clink? The plot twist has already arrived, and it will prove much more terrifying than any fight in the ring, because Ali just showed Seagal the difference between cinema and eternity, and that difference was deadly. In that very second, when the silence in the ballroom of the Beverly Hills mansion became so dense that it seemed one could suffocate in it, something happened that violated all laws of human biomechanics. Steven Seagal, whose fingers were locked on Muhammad Ali's wrist in a death grip, suddenly felt his confidence turn into icy sweat running down his spine. You expect to hear the crunch of bones or a cry of pain. You're wrong. Instead, a sound rang out in the air that no one could associate with a fight. It was a quiet, crystal-clear clink of ice hitting the sides of the glass. But why did this sound cause the attendees, producers, actors, and business sharks a sense of primal terror? The answer is hidden in Ali's right hand, in our plot Dagger, which at that moment was rewriting history right before the eyes of the frozen public. Ali was still holding that same glass of water, and while Seagal put all 110 kilograms of his weight into trying to twist the legend's arm, the surface of the water in the glass remained perfectly flat, like a mirror. This was that very Santa Barbara effect that makes your brain stall from the paradox. The world considered Ali a hostage of disease, but in this second, it became clear that he was the only person in the room who completely controlled the chaos. Seagal began to turn purple. His muscles bulged like steel cables. He tried to turn the boxer's wrist using the full arsenal of his Aikido, but Ali's arm didn't just not yield. It began to vibrate. This was not the Parkinson's tremor. This was a high-frequency vibration transmitted to Seagal through the point of contact, and the actor suddenly realized a terrifying thing. He wasn't holding an old man's arm. He was holding a live electrical cable carrying a current of incredible power. Question: how can a man with a destroyed nervous system generate an impulse that paralyzes a martial arts master? The answer came with Ali's whisper, which sounded in this vacuum silence like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Ali leaned close to Seagal's ear, so close that only a millimeter of space separated them, and uttered a phrase that forever destroyed the Hollywood myth of the invincible master. "Steven," Ali whispered, and his voice in this second was devoid of any stutter. It was firm as granite. "You spent your whole life learning how to break people, but you never understood that you cannot break what has no form. You are fighting my hand, but I am fighting your fear." In that moment, that very intellectual orgasm of realization occurred. Seagal understood that he had lost the fight even before he grabbed Ali. He was a hostage to his technique, his titles, and his ego, while Ali was absolutely free. The viewer expects Ali to deliver a crushing blow now, but Bruce Lee once taught Ali the secret of the punch without a punch. and the greatest decided to use it right now. Ali didn't try to break free. He simply microscopically changed the vector of his weight, and in that same second, the incredible happened. Seagal was literally thrown back by an invisible wave. His fingers released on their own, the will to fight evaporated, and the Action King stumbled over the edge of an expensive Persian rug, barely staying on his feet. His face, usually expressing icy calm, turned into a mask of total childlike incomprehension. He looked at his palms, which were now burning with fire, and didn't understand how a sick man could do this to him without making a single swing. Ali continued to stand in the same place. He slowly raised his right hand and brought the glass of water to his lips. Look, or rather, listen, to this silence. He took a sip, and not a single drop was spilled. Not one. This was proof that his tremor was merely a mask he removed when he wanted to show true strength. "Dance, Steven," Ali said, and that same mischievous glint from 1964 reappeared in his eyes. "The movie is over. Life begins." Seagal stood surrounded by his retinue, who just a minute ago considered him a god, but now they looked at him like an actor who had forgotten his lines. But here, the plot takes the final, sharpest turn of this part, at the moment when Seagal, with his head hung low, began to make his way to the exit. Ali suddenly froze and looked at the door leading to the terrace. His face became a motionless mask again, and the glass in his hand suddenly emitted a sharp, warning clink, as if the ice inside felt the approach of something much more dangerous than the wounded ego of a movie star. Did you think Seagal was the main threat of the evening? Oh no. Ali knew that the real enemy, the one for whose meeting he had come to this party in the first place, had just entered the house through the back door. And this enemy wasn't going to play at grappling or hold philosophical conversations. But who could frighten a man who had just humiliated Seagal with a single look? And why was this secret guest clutching an identical glass of water, just like Ali's? The answer to this mystery will overturn everything you knew about the final years of Muhammad Ali's life. But before we open this door, you must learn the terrible price Ali paid for those 10 seconds of control over his body. In that very second when Steven Seagal, stumbling and dropping the remnants of his Hollywood dignity, disappeared behind the heavy oak doors of the living room, a dead, ringing silence fell over the Beverly Hills mansion, so quiet you could hear the carbon dioxide bubbles bursting in the champagne glasses on the tables. You probably think the guests rushed to Muhammad Ali with congratulations, wanting to touch the living god who had just performed a miracle? You're wrong. A sticky, almost tangible fear hung in the hall because the people, those very producers and stars used to buying reality with money, had just seen something that defied logic and budget. They looked at Ali, who was still standing motionless, and in their eyes was the question, who or what is actually hiding under this mask of a sick old man? But while the crowd remained in a daze, a catastrophe was unfolding inside Muhammad himself that no one suspected. Look, or rather listen, to our plot dagger, to that very glass of water Ali still gripped in his right hand. The quiet, barely audible clink of ice was suddenly replaced by a violent, feverish rattling. The water, which a second ago was a motionless mirror, was now splashing over the edge, soaking his fingers and the sleeve of his expensive jacket. Ask yourself, why did his body rebel right now when the enemy was defeated? The answer turns this triumph into a physiological horror. Those 10 seconds of absolute rest that Ali demonstrated to Seagal were not a healing, but an act of monstrous suicidal violence against his own nervous system. He literally ordered his brain to be silent, using reserves of will that an ordinary person spends over a decade. And now the moment of reckoning had come, a dopamine crash that made his vision go dark. Ali felt his muscles begin to turn to stone, the invisible vice of Parkinson's tightening on his throat, depriving him of the ability to take a breath. He understood that if he fell now, if his body collapsed onto this Persian rug in convulsions, The myth of his invulnerability he had just restored would die with him. He needed to leave, and leave immediately. But his legs no longer obeyed him. They felt as if they were rooted to the floor. And here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making your heart skip a beat. In the doors leading to the terrace, a man appeared, whose face made Ali flinch. This was not a bodyguard, and not a fan. It was a man in a sharp gray suit, with a face devoid of any emotion, and in his hand was an identical glass of water, just like Ali's. The viewer at this moment expects this to be a coincidence or a waiter, but here lies the solution that makes your skin crawl. This man was Ali's personal physician, his shadow guardian, who followed him everywhere. And the glass in his hand was not just water, it was a chemical key, an emergency dose of medication dissolved in liquid that Ali had to take immediately, so his brain wouldn't burn out from the overstrain. But why was this doctor looking not at Ali, but at that very producer who organized the party? And why did the producer, in response to that look, give a barely perceptible nod, as if they were accomplices in some secret experiment on the greatest? Ali shifted his gaze from his trembling glass to the glass in the doctor's hand, and an intellectual orgasm of realization occurred in his head. He understood that this entire scene with Seagal, this entire challenge and humiliation was planned. He had been provoked. He was forced to push himself to the limit to see what his body was capable of under pressure. Seagal was merely a pawn, a useful idiot in the hands of people who wanted to see how much magic was left in the dragon before writing him off. Ali felt rage, pure and hot, begin to fight his frailty. He realized he had been betrayed by those he trusted with his life. He slowly, overcoming the hellish pain in his joints, raised his glass and, instead of drinking, simply released his fingers. The crystal shattered to pieces on the floor, and splashes of water hit the doctor's shoes. This was his answer to the system, silent but furious. Ali turned and, staggering but refusing help, headed for the exit. He walked through the crowd, which parted before him in sacred terror, and every step he took was a blow to the plans of those who considered him their property. But the main question still hung in the air. What price would he pay for this rebellion? Ali knew that tomorrow he wouldn't be able to get out of bed, that his voice would vanish for weeks. But today he had defeated not only Seagal, he had defeated those who wanted to turn his greatness into a laboratory report. However, he didn't notice that in his jacket pocket, where that very detail we will name in the finale used to lie, it was now empty. Someone had stolen his only chance at a normal life in these final years. But who? And why did this person need to deprive Ali of his last weapon? The twist you couldn't have predicted is already here, and it will reveal the secret Ali kept until the very end. When the echo of the shattered crystal finally died out in the suffocating luxury of the Beverly Hills living room, Muhammad Ali began his last, heaviest march toward the exit, and every step he took on the soft rug sounded in this tomb-like silence, like a bell tolling for a passing era. You probably think that at this moment he felt like a victor, a king who had just publicly dethroned a Hollywood pretender and challenged his own betraying doctors. That is the sweet illusion we love to feed ourselves at the end of every heroic story. But reality was permeated with the smell of blood and burnt electricity. Inside Ali's skull at this second, a true nuclear decay was occurring. That very dopamine crash I warned about turned his body into a piece of heavy, unwieldy lead, and only an inhuman, almost divine will forced his legs to move forward, past the frozen faces of people who just a minute ago considered him an exhibit in the museum of their own boredom. Ali walked through the crowd, which parted before him in sacred, superstitious terror, and no one, absolutely no one, dared to reach out a hand to support him, because in his gaze, fixed on the void of the doorway, was something that lies beyond human understanding. But in the second his fingers touched the cold handle of the limousine door, Ali suddenly froze, and a convulsion of such force passed through his body that he nearly collapsed onto the asphalt. He instinctively pressed his hand to his jacket pocket, and at that moment his face, devoid of expression, twisted into the first real grimace of the evening, a grimace of total, crushing despair. He realized he had lost not a fight, but something much more important. His pocket was empty. That very object, our main plot dagger, which Ali guarded like the apple of his eye, and which was the key to his secret control over his body, had vanished. Do you think it was pills? Or a secret talisman? Oh no, the truth is much more complex and technological for that time. It was a small, old silver stopwatch that Ali always carried with him. You might ask, why does a disabled man need a stopwatch? Here comes the moment of intellectual orgasm that overturns everything you just heard. Ali didn't heal through the power of thought. He hacked the rhythms of his own brain. He knew his Parkinson's worked in cycles, and he used this stopwatch to calculate those very windows of stability when the tremor subsides for a few seconds. He didn't just stand motionless before Seagal. He synchronized his movements with micro pauses in the work of his destroyed nervous system, turning his disease into a complex mathematical dance. And now this device, this proof that his greatness was the result of cold calculation and not a miracle, had been stolen. Ask yourself honestly, who could commit such a base crime in a moment of supreme tension? Ali turned and saw in the mansion window the silhouette of that very producer who organized this experiment. The producer held the stopwatch in his hands and slowly, with a sadistic smile, pressed the reset button. He didn't want money. He wanted to own the greatest secret. He wanted to have proof that Ali was not a god, but merely a brilliant engineer of his own decay. This was the Santa Barbara effect in its filthiest manifestation. The man who pretended to be a friend and fan turned out to be a vulture who ripped from the hands of the dying lion his last crutch. Ali looked at him, and in this silent duel of gazes through the glass, the final recognition of the system's defeat before the spirit occurred. Ali didn't go back. He didn't demand the item back. He simply got into the car and closed the door, forever leaving in that house his last hope for technical control over his ailment. Years later, that same producer on his deathbed would admit that the stopwatch became his curse. He tried to decipher Ali's algorithm. He spent millions on research, but he never could understand how a man with such a degree of brain destruction could hit those minuscule fractions of a second of rest. Ali, after that night, never again tried to switch off his tremor publicly. He accepted his shaking as part of his new image, as the vibration of history itself passing through him. That evening in Beverly Hills became a legend, whispered about in the corridors of Hollywood, but no one knew the true price of those 10 seconds of immobility. Ali sacrificed the remnants of his neural connection with reality to prove to Seagal and the whole world that the spirit has no weight categories and does not fear diagnoses. He saved his legacy, but finally locked himself in silence, paying for 1 minute of control with years of subsequent silence. And now, as we stand on the ruins of this great biography, watching how time mercilessly erases the details, I want to ask you a question that will divide you into two irreconcilable camps. We are used to worshiping strength. We love to watch our idols win against all odds. But look at Ali that evening. Was he a true hero who committed an act of ultimate self-sacrifice, destroying his health to give us one last myth of human omnipotence? Or was he a hostage of pride who couldn't come to terms with his weakness and turned his disease into a circus attraction for rich vultures, allowing them to use him for one effective scene? Does a legend have the right to such a lie if that lie inspires millions but kills the man himself? Whose side are you on in this debate about the price of greatness? the side of the beautiful myth that demands sacrifice, or the side of the bitter truth that demands humility? Write one word in the comments, myth or truth. And write at what minute you realized that the glass of water in his hand was not just water, but a challenge to death itself. I will be waiting for your answers, because within them lies the solution to why we actually need heroes, to believe in them or to justify our own weakness through them.